Nobody warned Laurel Briggs that marrying into the Calloway family meant marrying into their opinions, too. She found that out on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after the wedding, when her father-in-law Raymond Calloway pushed his plate back 2 inches from his chest. Not all the way, just enough to make a point, and said, May used to season her venison different. May was dead. May had been dead for 11 years. And yet May's pot roast, May's cornbread, May's way of doing just about everything had survived her in this household, like a second woman living in the walls. Laurel picked up her fork and said nothing. That was the first lesson she learned at Calloway Ranch. Silence was not weakness. Silence was strategy. She had come from Odessa, Texas, the second daughter of a plumber and a school librarian, who taught her that the most useful thing a person could own was a skill nobody else thought to bother learning. Her mother canned vegetables in August. Her father rewired the fuse box himself. Laurel grew up believing that competence was its own kind of quiet dignity. She was 28 when she met Clay Calloway at a cattle auction in Abilene. He was tall, sun-darkened, with the kind of easy confidence that came from growing up on land that had been in the family for 4 generations. He laughed at her joke about a Hereford that kept backing away from the fence. He bought her a coffee from the vending machine that tasted like motor oil, and he apologized for it like it was his personal fault. She thought he was different, and he was, in most ways. Clay was not a cruel man. He was not unkind. But he had grown up in a household that ran on a particular set of beliefs about what women were good at and what they weren't. And those beliefs had settled into him the way limestone settles into a riverbed. Slow, quiet, and almost impossible to notice until you're already stuck. He thought she was sweet. He thought she was pretty, even when the people at his church whispered that she was big for a bride and not what they'd pictured for Clay. He ignored those comments to her face. He agreed with them, privately, in the parts of himself he never examined. What he thought about her cooking, he made clear on their second month at the ranch. You use too much flour in the gravy, he said, not angry. Just factual, the way a man corrects a fence post that's leaning. I use the same amount I always use, Laurel said. May used less. There it was again. May. Laurel had never met May Calloway. She'd seen photographs, a lean, angular woman with gray eyes and an apron she seemed to wear like a second skin. In every photo, May was working, canning, baling, standing in the garden with dirt on her knees and satisfaction on her face. Laurel had looked at those photos and thought, I understand that woman. But the version of May that lived in Clay's memory had been sanded smooth into something more like a saint than a person. And saints, Laurel was learning, are very difficult to compete with. The Calloway spread ran about 4,000 acres outside a small town called Drywater, which had once had a creek running through it and now had only the name. They ran Black Angus cattle, about 340 head when Laurel arrived, and they employed 3 full-time ranch hands, a wiry older man named Pete, his nephew Cody, and a quiet woman in her 40s named Ruth, who had been working the property longer than anyone, and whom Raymond treated like furniture he'd forgotten was alive. Laurel noticed Ruth immediately. She also noticed that Ruth never ate with the men at the table. She took her meals on the porch, alone, with a paperback book she kept in her back pocket. Laurel started taking her coffee out there some mornings. You don't have to, Ruth said the first time. I know, Laurel said. They became something close to friends, or at least the kind of women who understand each other without needing to say much. Ruth had been running the books for the ranch, informally for 3 years, not because Raymond had asked her to, but because she had noticed the accounting was wrong and couldn't stand watching money disappear without knowing where it went. She kept a notebook in her truck. She'd never mentioned it to Raymond because Raymond, she said simply, was not the kind of man who liked being shown where he was wrong. Laurel asked if she could look at the notebook. Ruth handed it over without a word. The numbers told a story that nobody in the Calloway house had been willing to read. Laurel sat with that notebook for 3 evenings at the kitchen table after the dishes were done, comparing Ruth's figures against the actual receipts she found in the filing cabinet in Raymond's office. A cabinet that had been unlocked, she noted, which meant nobody thought there was anything in there worth hiding or worth finding. The ranch was bleeding money from 3 directions at once. First, the feed costs. Raymond had been buying from the same supplier for 20 years out of loyalty, and that supplier had quietly raised his prices 4 times in the last 6 years without Raymond noticing, because Raymond didn't track costs year over year. He just paid the invoices. Laurel compared the current rate against 2 competitors she found with a single afternoon of phone calls and found they were overpaying by nearly 19%. Second, the mineral supplements. They were buying a branded product with a name that sounded trustworthy and paying a premium for it. The active ingredient was the same compound available under a generic label at a third of the cost. Laurel knew this because her father-in-law's veterinarian had mentioned it offhandedly at a herd check the previous spring, and Raymond had nodded and then done nothing. Third, and this one was the slow wound, the kind that doesn't hurt until you've lost too much blood to notice. They were undervaluing their calves at sale. Raymond sold to the same buyer at a regional auction, same buyer every year because it was familiar. But cattle prices had shifted, the market had spread out, and other buyers were paying 8 to 12% more for the same weight class. Nobody had looked. 3 problems, none of them catastrophic on their own. Together, compounding across 4 years, they had quietly consumed what should have been a profitable operation and turned it into a ranch that was, as of the February she sat with Ruth's notebook, approximately $62,000 further from solvency than anyone in the main house realized. Laurel closed the notebook. She sat with that number for a long time. Then she went to bed and said nothing, because she was still deciding what kind of woman she was going to be in this marriage. She had not planned to say anything at all. That's the truth, and it's important. She had told herself, lying in the dark beside Clay's sleeping form, that this was not her ranch, not her name on the deed, not her father's legacy. She had come here and been measured against a dead woman and found wanting, and she had swallowed it and kept cooking and kept cleaning and kept doing the 100 invisible things that kept the household running, while the men talked about cattle prices at dinner without once asking her what she thought. She had done all of that, and she had not complained, because she was not the complaining kind. But she was also not the kind of woman who could watch something she cared about, even something that hadn't fully decided to care about her yet, fall apart while she stood by with her hands folded. The ranch was struggling. Ruth knew it. Laurel knew it. And in March, Clay came home from a meeting with the bank with a look on his face that told her the bank was starting to know it too. He sat at the kitchen table and didn't take his hat off, which was how she knew it was serious. They want to see a plan, he said, operating plan, showing how we intend to turn it around before we go back for the seasonal line of credit. Raymond, from the living room, we've always gotten that line of credit. Yes, sir, Clay said carefully. But the numbers this year are different. A long silence. I'll think of something, Raymond said, and turned the television back up. Clay sat there staring at the table. Laurel poured him a cup of coffee and set it down in front of him. He looked up at her. She almost said it then. She almost slid Ruth's notebook across the table and said, I've been looking at the books, and I think I know where the problems are. Instead, she asked if he wanted dinner, and he said yes, and she went to the stove. She cooked that night with more precision than usual, not to prove anything, just because it was the only place in that house where she felt completely certain of herself. The thing that changed her mind was not a conversation. It was a morning. She was out in the east pasture before sunrise, because Ruth had mentioned one of the heifers was acting off, and Laurel had taken to walking the perimeter fence on early mornings because she liked the way the ranch looked before anyone else was awake to tell her what to think about it. She found the heifer, and the heifer was fine, just ornery, Ruth's favorite kind. But while she was standing there in the blue-gray light watching the cattle move slow and certain across the grass, she thought about her mother. Her mother, who had spent 30 years in a public library, watching people come in looking for answers to problems they'd been too embarrassed to ask anyone directly. Books on debt, books on disease, books on divorce. Her mother never told a soul what she saw in those checkout records. She just quietly made sure the right books were on the shelves. The most useful thing you can own, her mother had said, is a skill nobody else thought to bother learning. Laurel went back to the house and got Ruth's notebook. She did not go to Clay first. She went to Raymond. She knew that would surprise people. It surprised her a little, but she had understood something about Raymond Calloway in the months she'd spent in his house. He was not a bad man. He was a proud man, and those are different things. A bad man enjoys causing harm. A proud man just builds walls around the parts of himself he can't bear to examine and lives smaller and smaller inside them. She knocked on the doorframe of his office. He kept the door open, always, because a rancher with a closed door was a rancher not watching his land. "Got a minute?" she asked. He looked up from the equipment catalog he'd been reading. He looked mildly surprised, which was his version of quite surprised. "Suppose so," he said. She sat down across from him and set Ruth's notebook on the desk, and then her own legal pad next to it, 3 pages of figures she'd written out in her clearest handwriting, organized into the 3 problem areas with proposed solutions beside each one. She did not say, "I found these." She said, "I've been looking at some things, and I think there might be some room to improve the margin before the bank meeting." Raymond looked at the notebook. He looked at the legal pad. He looked at her. "Where'd you get these numbers?" he said. "Some from Ruth, some from the filing cabinet, some from phone calls I made last week." A long pause. "You made phone calls to compare feed suppliers?" "Yes, sir. And I called Dale Whitmore over at the Sutton County auction. He said he'd be interested in talking about taking on some of our calves this year." Raymond's expression had gone very still. She couldn't read it. She said, "I'm not trying to step on anything. I grew up watching my dad lose a contract because he didn't know a competitor had dropped their rates, and I guess it made me the kind of person who checks." Another pause. The clock on his wall ticked 4 times. "Leave that," he said, nodding at the legal pad. She left it. She didn't know what Raymond did with the legal pad. He didn't tell her, and she didn't ask. But the following week, Clay came home from a second bank meeting with a different look on his face. Something lighter. He sat at the table and he took his hat off, which was how she knew it had gone better. "Dad put together a plan," he said. "Switching suppliers, adjusting where we sell. Bank approved the line of credit." "Good," Laurel said. Clay looked at her. Something was working behind his eyes. He was not a stupid man. He had been a man who didn't look carefully, and those are different things. "Did you have anything to do with that?" he asked. She turned back to the stove. "Your dad had the information. He made the decisions," which was true. Clay was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Laurel." She looked at him. "May," he started. Then he stopped, started again. "I've been comparing you to someone who isn't here to compare anymore." He stopped again. He was not a man practiced in this kind of language. "That's not fair to you." She held his gaze. "No," she said, "it's not." He nodded slowly, like a man absorbing something he should have absorbed a long time ago. "Your gravy's better," he said finally. "For the record," she almost laughed. She didn't, quite. "I know," she said. The next part happened gradually, the way most real things do. Raymond started leaving the filing cabinet locked after hours, which meant he was actually filing things now instead of just stacking them. He didn't say anything to Laurel directly. Raymond was not built for direct. But he started leaving the office door open a little wider when she passed, and once in April he asked her what she thought about switching the calving schedule. She told him. He listened. Ruth got a raise finally, and a proper title, Operations Coordinator, which was just a formal name for what she'd been doing for 3 years without credit. That was Clay's doing. Laurel had mentioned once that Ruth's notebook had saved them some real trouble. Clay had gone quiet and then done something about it, which was she was learning how he processed most things, slow but genuine. The feed supplier switch happened in May. The first order came in 14% cheaper than the one before it. Raymond looked at the invoice for a long time and then put it in the folder without comment. Pete told Cody that Mrs. Calloway had a head for numbers. Cody told Ruth. Ruth told Laurel, grinning. "Mrs. Calloway," Laurel repeated. "Lord, you want me to tell them to call you something else?" "Laurel," she said. Just Laurel. Summer came hard that year, a dry summer, the kind that turns the creek beds to cracked plates and makes the cattle restless and the ranchers short-tempered. Raymond lost 15 pounds from the heat and the worry and the work, and for the first time since Laurel had known him, he looked like an old man. She made sure there was food on the table. Real food, the kind that stuck. Biscuits at breakfast, black-eyed peas at noon, brisket on Sundays from the small chest freezer where she kept the cuts she'd been saving since March. She made cobbler from peaches Ruth had canned the previous fall. She made sweet tea strong enough to stand a spoon in. She fed everyone who came through that house. Pete and Cody ate at the table. Now, Ruth too. Raymond, after the second Sunday, stopped mentioning May. Not because he'd forgotten. She didn't think Raymond would ever forget. But because there was something else at that table now that hadn't been there before. The steady, particular proof that somebody was paying attention. That the work mattered. That the people doing it mattered. That's what food is, really, when it's done right. Not just fuel attention. In September, the ranch turned a slim profit for the first time in 4 years. Not much. Enough. Enough to clear the short-term debt and come into winter with the line of credit intact and a small reserve that Raymond immediately said he wasn't going to touch and then argued with Clay about for 2 weeks, which Laurel observed with something close to contentment. They were arguing about the future. That was new. She was pulling a pan of cornbread out of the oven when Clay came into the kitchen that evening, September still orange and heavy in the window. He stood beside her at the counter. Not dramatic about it. Just stood there. You saved this place, he said. Ruth saved this place, she said. I just did the math, Laurel. She looked at him. You know what I mean, he said. She did know what he meant. She also knew that it would have been easy in those early months to let the resentment win. To decide that a husband who compared her to his dead mother, and a father-in-law who barely spoke to her, and a household that treated her like a decoration, weren't worth the effort of saving. She had stood at that edge more than once. She was not a saint, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. But she had chosen, not for them, not to prove something, not to win. She had chosen for the same reason she'd always done things. Because she saw a problem she knew how to fix, and walking away from a problem you can fix is just a different kind of waste. I know, she said. Clay was quiet for a moment. Then, what can I do? And she thought about that. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about feed invoices and calf weights and mineral compositions, because it was a real question and it deserved a real answer. Stop talking about what May would have done, she said. Start asking what I think. He held her gaze. That's fair, I know it is. He almost smiled. You always know, usually, she said, and picked up her cornbread. The winter that year was milder than anyone expected. December came in soft, and the cattle were calm, and Raymond got some color back in his face. On Christmas Eve, he came into the kitchen while Laurel was cooking, just stood in the doorway, the way he'd done the first night she'd knocked on his office door, taking stock. Smells good, he said. Pecan pie, she said, and venison stew. A small pause. May used to make venison stew. She waited. This smells better, he said. And then he went back to the living room, and she stood at the stove with a wooden spoon in her hand, and the kitchen window fogged from the heat, and outside the land ran flat and pale and enormous, all the way to the edge of the sky, 4,000 acres of it. This strange and difficult place that was starting, slowly, imperfectly the way real things start, to feel like hers.